I'd like to welcome everyone to today's CIBM seminar. Our speaker is Dmitry Kondrashov, who's an instructional professor at the University of Chicago in the Biological Sciences Collegiate Division. Dmitry was a postdoctoral fellow at the University of Wisconsin-Madison in biochemistry and a CIBM postdoctoral fellow from 2005 to 7. And after that, he moved to his position at University of Chicago, initially as lecturer and now as instructional professor. I'll tell you a little bit about his background. He earned a BA in natural science, concentrating in chemistry from Simon's Rock College of Bard. He earned a master's in applied math from University of Arizona and a PhD in applied mathematics, minoring in biochemistry, also from University of Arizona. He's had plenty of research experience, and before graduate school, he was staff research assistant at Los Alamos National Lab. He was an applications chemist at Millipore Corporation in Bedford, Mass. And in Chicago, he teaches the Introduction to Quantitative Modeling for Biology, Mathematical Methods for Biological Sciences, and other courses. He's done some other teaching, including several one-week courses in biomedical informatics, sponsored by National Library of Medicine, at Marine Biology Lab and Augusta University in Georgia. In addition to his CIBM postdoctoral fellowship, he was awarded an NSF postdoctoral fellowship, but declined it. He's been awarded travel awards, ISMB, to Vienna, Austria. He was a faculty of 1,000 for recommended paper in, don't see the year, and he had the CIBM postdoctoral fellowship. So thank you very much, and he's traveled today from Chicago to be here. Thanks, Dmitry.
Thank you so much, Louise, and thanks everybody for coming here to, and I would like to share just a little bit about the things that Louise mentioned, which is my teaching work at the University of Chicago in biological sciences. And, but I want to start by putting things in kind of a broader perspective, which is, what is quantitative biology education? I think we probably don't need to convince anybody why it exists and why it's important. But I want to say first, kind of give you the big picture of what smart people have been, trying to decide what is it that is the core competencies in college education for future biologists. So this is from this Vision and Change in Undergraduate Biology Education report from the American Association for Advancement of Science. And so what you see is this is what they sort of summarized. And you see, so these are all sort of like active and relatively vague ideas for what are the important things for students to learn to be able to practice biology. So the ability to apply the process of science, ability to use quantitative reasoning, ability to use modeling and simulation, ability to tap into interdisciplinary nature of science, ability to communicate and collaborate with other disciplines, ability to understand the relationship between science and society. And so folks have been thinking about how to implement this big picture vision for a while. This is sort of one of many reports that have been put out by various smart institutions and folks over the past 10 or 20 years. I'd say there was a Bio 2010 report that came out in 2003 that I think kind of started a lot of this thinking. But what I want to show here is that even when thinking about the big picture of biological education, several of these relatively vague topics are definitely quantitatively based, right? So some of them explicitly, like ability to use quantitative reasoning and modeling and simulation, which are generally quantitative. And the others may be less directly, like tapping into interdisciplinarity and talking with folks from diverse backgrounds. and ability to communicate and collaborate. I would say that all of these are important objectives that myself and other people in biology education think about and think how to transform and perhaps improve what quantitative biology education has been historically. So, having said all this, I want to ask you some questions and perhaps write down your answers. So, here are my 3 questions, and I would really appreciate if, because this is something that I understand almost everybody here has seen on your own selves. Just actually, first, can you, by show of hands, can you tell me how many of you majored in biology in college or biology-related things? Okay, good. So maybe half the folks. Louise, great. So I would love to just hear from you, like in your biological education, what were the quantitative skills that you were expected to learn? Statistics. Thanks, Ryan. So yeah, so statistics is historically a part of the education, for sure. What about other, or maybe even like a specific skill that you remember? Did anybody learn calculus as part of it? Integrals. What about others? Integration. Differential equations. That's okay. So these are, I think, relatively standard, except maybe differential equations are not like the expected of everybody in the biological science major, right? Then I have a different question, maybe to, if you turn your mind back on, what were the frustrations and challenges of learning some of these skills. Do you think, just open-ended, do you remember what was the most challenging or what was the barrier that you needed to overcome to learn any of these or other quantitative skills? What do you think? Please.
Well, when you think about Calc 1, the only thing you ever did was like odd shapes and integrals of like a square or a cube, and it's never
In your calculus course, is that right?
Yeah.
So the barrier was, so what was the barrier about it being like odd shapes that you...
It's like I was like, I'm never going to use this.
Right, so, okay. I mean, I'm not right, sorry, I shouldn't say right. I mean, everybody's experience is absolutely valid and important. But yeah, but I think the question is, right, how is this, the applicability, is that fair?
Yeah.
So applicability, like, yeah, integrating solids of evolution or something, and you're like, okay, great, but like, what are you going to do? But I think that's one possible barrier. I don't know, do other folks have other experiences? Yes, please.
The most difficult thing for me is they would set up the problems and then go, the rest is just algebra.
Yeah, oh yeah.
That's the hard part.
Right, yeah. Yeah, so like algebraic manipulation, which a lot of courses just like, yeah, ultimately most of the work boils down to that, and if you're not comfortable with it or just hit a barrier, and then it seems like you're kind of stuck and frustrated, right? Other experiences? Any other barriers? I guess I'm not using my board very efficiently, but oh, aha. Yes, sorry.
I was just making the light was very good.
Oh, yes, I invented that. Yeah. No, so any other barriers that you remember for yourselves, or want to hypothesize other folks' experience? No. What do you think, Grant?
What about professors that want to do research and less teaching?
That's an interesting one. So yeah, like professor, maybe limited interest in teaching or limited time, let's say, right? I mean, we all know professors with research labs are extremely busy and, of course, limited time for teaching. But I think that's probably something that is a real, can be a real barrier. Like getting their time, right, if you need some. Yeah, I think, yeah, those are cool. I didn't have any of this in mind necessarily, so appreciate it. And now if I want to, I mean, I think you see where I'm going with this. Are most of you folks in research labs at the moment, right? How many are in a graduate program? Yay. How many are postdoctoral folks? Yay. Okay, great. Yeah, so a lot of folks, yeah, you're familiar with biological research. What skills do you think are the most useful that you use, quantitative skills that are like your everyday bread and butter? Please. Hypothesis testing, absolutely. Yeah, so like, yeah, this is where I'm thinking, like, where should I put, like, useful? Yeah, so hypothesis testing, I think, is very universally applicable for sure. What about other folks?
I'll say very quick order of magnitude estimating. Figure out
Ah,
something reasonable or not.
nice. did not have that in mind. So like, yeah, like so almost like what's it called, Fermi problems, right? Like where you just estimate. Yeah. So other useful skills, please. Dilutions.
Yeah, drawing like 1 to 1,000 or 100 or
When you're figuring out, right? Yeah, like your constant your solution, your buffer solution or something, right? Sure, like, so maybe this is like unit conversion? Is that right? Like, yeah, right, it's like practical calculations. Any other ones that folks use all the time? Yes, please.
Summarizing either the numerical way or visual way will always be useful.
Summarizing data. Yeah, thank you. That's super important. Yeah. So like data visualization and summary. I will say it for short. Data viz. Right. Yeah. So I think these are some of the probably the things. I mean, yeah, I've been in research labs. That's probably some of the research that some list of skills. And so of course my point is that there seems to be some overlap, I guess, if you say statistics does relate to some of these useful skills, but there's a lot of apparent mismatch. So here's what I want to then talk to you about. I want to talk about two things. One is basically what to teach, right? So, and one of the things I wanted to highlight was this mismatch or misalignment between what is traditionally part of the curriculum and what is really useful. So this is an old XKCD. I don't know how many people are still working with Perl. Yeah, but but that's I think a pretty common type of experience that people have. And then a different topic is, of course, in a way, more challenging to measure and to justify. But this is something that something did get Yeah, there we go. Okay. Yeah. So it's a well-known, and probably folks have experienced the phenomenon of intimidation and anxiety produced by quantitative content, just quantitative learning. And so how to best address this and to overcome that barrier. So that's something that nobody exactly mentioned in your own experiences, but I want to posit to you that it is a real barrier. So these are basically two different topics that I want to talk to you about in this talk today. And like I said, there's been this movement to rethink and reform quantitative biology education, and that's been going on at various schools, large and small. And I want to start by sharing one very recent publication from a group that I personally know pretty well, of several folks who at UCLA decided to rethink how the introduction to quantitative thinking works for biology students in a large state school. And so they have quite a bit of data. So I want to share just a little bit of data and what they did, and then tell you about my own experience. So here's what they did. The traditional requirement in UCLA, like I think a lot of schools, was I believe 2 or 3 calculus courses. I think they're on the quarter system like my institution as well. But so the specific comparison that they tried to make was between a regular calculus course that's called Math 3A, that's taught by math faculty or postdocs or grad students, I'm not sure exactly, but sort of regular math department denizens who typically grade in a standard way of saying, this fraction of students get an A, this fraction of students get a B, which is something this is one of the things I want to address is how best to assess and motivate students via the grading scheme and the feedback that the students receive. So this particular approach is one, right? If you only 10% of your class, for instance, gets an A, that means there's a disincentive to help each other. And so this is one of the things that the team at UCLA set out to change. So they developed a sequence of 2 courses, LS 30A and 30B, which they incorporated both quantitative faculty and biologists together, and some who are mathematical biologists. But they joint taught it together. They incorporated it into the standard biological science curriculum. And another difference was that they approached the grading not in this kind of typical point-based fashion, but instead by certain specifications that you needed to complete, and they encouraged students to work together to complete this instead of, so they didn't have a curve that was set. So they deliberately encouraged collaboration, and they de-emphasized a lot of the sort of usual calculus topics like integration by parts and limits and so on. So they focused on computation, they introduced linear algebra, and a lot of dynamic models is really the focus of and they produced a textbook. I'll show you, give you a reference at the end for this course. So then they published a relatively large-scale paper, data set in the paper just in December of last year. And this is so they asked several questions and they measured different things. But one of the things I found most interesting was the effect of taking. So they compared students who took the redesigned life science for biology, math for life science course, with students who took Math 3A, and they looked at their performance in later courses that they took afterwards. So in both cases, this was the first quantitative course that was taken by first year at UCLA. And so the question is, does having a collaborative-based and contextualized life science course, Could it be detrimental to your quantitative skills? Could it be helpful? And how is it reflected in 3 different courses? So they compared a chemistry course. I think this is like a Gen Chem course. I don't remember exactly. Life Sciences 2, which is a biology course later in the sequence, or a physics course. And so they looked at this, and the summary, and actually I cut off one of their non-parametric results. But basically they found that there was a very modest change in the mean performance in chemistry of the students who took the redeveloped Math for Life Science course, which is what you see over here. So you see this is the mean versus the mean for the students who took the math course. But more substantial, like, not huge, but definitely significantly better performance in both the life sciences course and the physics course that they took later. And this, as you can see, is for relatively large sizes, almost 1,000 students who had gone through both paths. So this is fairly encouraging. It's not, yes, please, Mark.
Sorry, I missed this in your credit, but were the students randomized according to which?
I do not believe they were randomized. I'm trying to remember this. So there, I should look at table 1 in more detail. I think it was more of just seeing that they're comparable groups of students with comparable backgrounds, but I don't think they were, actually randomly assigned to the 2 groups. Other thoughts? No. So then the second, there's several other sort of results from this, but another one is more of a subjective response. So were students more motivated, specifically how, in their own view, how much did their interest in the subject change? And so it changes pre and post taking the course of the first half of this Math for Life Sciences and the second half. And in both cases, there's a significant shift towards students reporting a high interest. You can see, so the yellow is pre and the green is post, and here the gray is pre and the blue is post. So there's students seem to report, at least, that they're more motivated and more interested after taking these courses. So this is seems like it could be an important consideration in terms of future motivation and persistence in the science pipeline, as we call it. So the two main conclusions that I took from it is there's perhaps modest but some evidence that there are gains from taking this sort of revamped and reformed Math for Life Sciences, even persisting several years into the future, and there is greater positive interest on the part of the students. Another thing that I didn't talk about, but one of the things that they're concerned in and that they have data for is whether students from lower lower level of like material success, such as folks on Pell Grants, whether this helps persistence in science, and for folks from different underrepresented gender and racial backgrounds, whether that is also something that helps them succeed. And so there's some encouraging data, but I think there's nothing particularly clear about that yet. But this is one of the motivations of this approach, is to try to also increase accessibility of science, in biology in particular. So now I want to tell you about my own experience developing a part of the biological sciences curriculum at the University of Chicago, specifically a course that I've been teaching now for almost 10 years. It's called Intro to Quantitative Modeling for Biology. And so my main objectives in that course are, the first one is to introduce students to basic coding. And kind of everything else is organized based on this the learning from like just assigning variables to then working a bit with data and data visualization, and then actually writing simple loops and things like that. So just basic increase in coding competency is then paired with certain concepts such as dynamic models, stochastic models, specifically like Markov models and so on, and some modest examples of data analysis and hypothesis testing as well. So this is kind of this mishmash course that is now a part of the biological sciences curriculum, and so students, instead of taking what they used to do 3 calculus courses, they take this as their 3rd quantitative course in the first year. All right, and so basically it's a big course, about 180 to 200 students. First year is in biology. They all have some calculus background, but there's no assumption that they've ever written a line of code. And as I said, so I can tell you a little bit more if folks are interested after the talk, but there's also an interface between this course and the skills and the content of it with subsequent biology courses, such as cell and molecular biology, physiology, genetics, so stuff like that. They also have computational labs that are developed specifically for, like, that build on these topics. And then I have another wrench that, or modification that was really inspired by Spring 2020 and everybody going remote. And what happened was, so for us actually it was right at the beginning of the spring term at Chicago. And I, had to figure out how to teach 200 students online on Zoom. And the first thing I thought is, I do not want to try to come up with some timed exams that people can take over, like I just thought it was, it required either invasive so-called proctoring or other horrible things. And so I try to simplify things and say, I want to focus on learning and giving students skills, and I want to come from the assumption that students are interested in the same thing, right? So to do that, I gave them coding assignments that I said, okay, here are the things to do. The TAs are there to help in small groups, and they can ask them any questions, and then they they won't write the code for them, but they will get a lot of help. And then if they complete them, hopefully that sparks their greater understanding of the more conceptual topics as well. So I basically went to this completion grading. You have to complete it, and then I gave them multiple chances to revise and resubmit until they got it complete. I tried to be as flexible as possible, especially that first spring. And then I instituted a bunch of surveys to try to get more feedback and understand how things are going. And then finally, so last spring, I added one more thing because I abolished all exams. And I thought, but like a final challenge still can be really useful. So I added something that it was challenging for me as well, which was to develop open-ended projects for 200 students and then have to read them all, which I did. So I want to tell you about these experiments, if you will. So the thing that I did for the online courses, which these last two spring quarters were both online. So I try to make information accessible in multiple ways, right? So I developed interactive tutorials that people could do online in R. The They're short videos, not like hour and a half long lecture, but short videos on all the topics. Then we had the Zoom meetings where they could be more, we can be more interactive or have them work through exercises with my help. There were these small Zoom sessions. There was online discussion, and then there was some extra just like help sessions. Okay, so that's what I did. So now I want to tell you how it worked out. So one of the positive, so I'll start with the, right, so I talked about two different things. One, the sort of more maybe cognitive and psychological about intimidation and just, barriers that students get frustrated. So one of the things that is positive, at least if you believe the students' self-reported surveys, is that their intimidation levels, definitely self-reported intimidation levels, dropped. So I asked them, do you feel intimidated by doing programming or coding? So that's the first question. And you can see here, prior to taking the course, the red are the ones that are intimidated. The dark red strongly agree, light red just agree. So quite a few people said, I feel intimidated. So that dropped quite a bit for after the course. And then these two were the same for mathematical tasks and then for statistical tasks. So they dropped, although not as dramatically as well. And then I had a similar picture actually from last year, from 2021. Slightly different, but again, like a really substantial drop, especially for coding, which I guess makes sense because a lot of students were new to it prior to taking the course. So perhaps, having been introduced to it, reduced their intimidation levels. All right, so that's one thing that I think is pretty positive. Then what do they like in terms of, like I just said, do you enjoy it? My options for them, this is like an informal Likert scale. Did you love it? Did you like it? Was it meh? Did you didn't like it? Or did you hate it? For the four kind of different things that I try to incorporate into the course, the like math analysis, the coding, data analysis, or modeling, like building models, which we did to some extent. And so you see, so once again, interestingly, the coding part was the one that they reported enjoying the most, again, subjectively, in spring 2020, and here the similar result from spring 2021. Again, seems like the coding was the one they enjoyed the most. Although actually, I guess now I look at it, it looks like the data analysis they hated the least, if you look at the blue, right? So maybe there's something to that too. But I mean, they're pretty positive overall, so that's good. And then another interesting, but maybe expected result in terms of which of those, right? So I mentioned 6 different communication methods in the online course, which I should say, thankfully, I will not be teaching online in starting next week when I start the spring of this year. But from online, the ones that they found the most useful were the online discussion, the tutorials they could do at any point, and the videos that they could watch at any time. So basically the asynchronous resources, the ones that students could access whenever. They were more positive, they felt substantially more positive about those 3 compared to the other 3, and that pattern was pretty similar to in 2021. Although I'd say here, the small lab groups that students worked in here, I guess they felt pretty good about those, even those were synchronous.
So the tutorials.
Yeah.
You make the tutorials?
Yeah. Yeah, so I made they're tutorials that explain something like, okay, here's how you write a function in R, and then there are little exercises that if you can write the answers and then check whether your code is correct. So yeah, so I made 10 tutorials for them to learn. And then here's the subjective assessment of the students. How did they feel about their final project, which, as I said, was the first, I introduced it last spring for the first time. The most common response, this is not the best way of visualizing, I apologize, but But you can see the most common response was it was tough but useful. And second was loved it and learned a lot. And then some students found it frustrating. And then a few did not complete it. So my objective with the final project was to give them a challenge that was not so easy. Like basically a lot of the coding assignments were like, we will give you all of the tools and we will hold your hand and help you complete them. Basically, if you show up and you try, then you can complete all of the coding assignments. For the final project, it was much more try to do this yourself without like all the things spelled out for you. So I can tell you a little bit more about what type of projects. I gave them 4 options or gave them the option of developing their own. But all of them required learning something a bit more. For example, using tidyverse and R to analyze data, stuff like that I did not teach in the course. So, but it seems like for the most part they quite liked it. So now that was the subjective results. So now I want to tell you a little bit about how we measured student success and then what they said about the course. So first I want to show you now I want to compare the two, basically, so in 2020 and 2021, the courses I took, I took away all those timed exams and taught the courses online, so I relied a lot more on online feedback and all that stuff. But here in this table, I just want to show you that a lot of the background of the students was comparable across these 3 years. So first, the enrollment was about the same. I got, because I'm really pushy and I guess through the Canvas, I can poke people who didn't complete the survey until they do, and because that was part of their participation grade. So almost everybody completed my survey, so I wanted to get good participation in the data. One thing that I changed was that I wanted to understand whether some of these student attitudes or experiences had an effect downstream on their performance, and if I made the initial survey anonymous, I couldn't track who, how those things interacted. So I changed it from my initial survey from anonymous to not anonymous. But otherwise, they were really comparable. Out of those students, so I mentioned that in their background, their quantitative background prior to taking the course, some were tracked into the low-level math, so I wanted to see whether that made a difference. And there were about the same number of students, 34, 46, and 22, had been in the lower-level calculus sequence, and then some had taken upper-level math, not many. But I just wanted to point out that these were sort of separate group, whereas the rest were in the more middle-of-the-road calculus based on their placement scores. And also some students had taken a computer science course before, but you see not that many out of 180. And then some of them, 73 and 60-something, took a statistics course before. So I just wanted to see whether any of those had an effect on how well they did in the course. And what do I mean by how well they did in the course? So you might ask, how did I measure this after being very, very kind of flexible and allowing students to basically work and revise and so on. So this is how it affected their grades, right? So there's 7, actually now there's 8 coding assignments, and and they were based just complete or incomplete. In these 2 years. In 2019, I was still using more point-based scoring for that and had some exams. So with that, basically, definitely smaller number of students got A's or A minuses, right, when on their more traditional assessment scheme. Then a whole bunch more in the spring of 2020, right? And we definitely got some words, not just me, but a lot of faculty at Chicago, from deans saying that we think there's a bit of grade inflation going on, and we understand there's a pandemic going on. So one of the things I tried to introduce this final project challenge in part to basically allow everybody to get a good grade if they put in the effort, but also give them a bit of a challenge to get an excellent grade. But still, quite a few students got an excellent grade. The question is, I guess, is that detrimental to learning, right? Does that encourage students, I don't know, slacking and not caring so much if it's so many students get A's? So that's I think a very legitimate question. So here's what I want to show you. Oh yeah, so this is a slightly different question, but I still want to show you. One of the things I wanted to see is, can we have some predictors of success? Are there certain backgrounds that make students less likely to succeed? And maybe if we know this ahead of time, maybe there are interventions and things that we can do to help students learn better. Well, so it turned out that a lot of this, the background information that I told you seemed to have no significant impact that I could tell. And so here the course success was defined as getting an A or A minus. So just to make things binary. And so for example, having a prior computer science course or prior advanced math course did not seem to do very much in terms of the fraction success. The one thing that really did make a difference was for the students that had been tracked into the lower level math sequence. That's the one where there's a real significant difference in terms of the fraction of students who succeeded, right? So those who took lower level calc, 61% got an A minus, but those who took any other, 86% did. So that's, and that was consistent also in 2021. So it's not a surprising result, but it's interesting that was the one thing that seemed to make the most difference. Oh yeah, and then subjectively, the question is, after, did you enjoy the class? And then, agree or disagree. And then after taking this class, I feel more positive about quantitative skills. And both of those, at least subjectively, were true in 2019. In 2020, that was slightly even higher. And in 2021, once again, people seem to feel pretty positive. And then finally, the thing that I was leading up to, this is the hardest thing, is how do you assess whether students learn independently of what my grading scheme was, right? So that's the thing, because I tried to make, my approach was, like I said, I will help you learn, try not to stress students out. There's no curve, but the question is, does that mean that their actual acquisition of skills and knowledge suffer, right? That's the question. And so my answer to this, so I try to address this in an independent way in using two different metrics. So one is this assessment tool that has this kind of cute name, BioSquare. It was developed by a whole team of quantitative biology and psychologists and learning and education experts at University of Minnesota and Iowa and Carleton College, the big team of people. So I just took their tool. They let me funnel students to them, and they send me results. So the students took this same test before taking the course and after, right? So this was something that was separate from the grades that I assigned. The one thing about it, unfortunately, so this is a tool that was developed independently of this course and my objectives, so that it didn't really mesh very well with what the course was doing. So a lot of the topics and questions were fairly basic. They were aimed at people who had not really seen any calculus, and there was absolutely no coding involved in those questions. So it didn't really it didn't really cover the same ground, but still some things were there. So there was algebra functions and modeling, there was statistics and probability questions, some of which are also involved in my course, and some data visualization, interpreting things. So really, it's a well-designed tool. But here are the results. Fraction of correct questions for my students. So this was in 2019. And so I kind of did, so I split them up into the questions that were relevant for the course and not relevant. And what you can see, the trouble is that the students that we get pretty much even from the get-go knew the majority of those topics, right? So you see, so they went up, like neither of those are significant if you run a test on them. But they didn't deteriorate, which is nice. Maybe there was a tiny bit of a bump for the relevant questions, but mostly not really. Mostly it's just they maybe did slightly better. And the same, but the good thing is, one thing you can say in 2020, they didn't seem to do any worse at the very least, right? After this crazy pandemic-induced disruption and me dropping all exams, they still did pretty okay. But then I thought of a different way of assessing it that was actually tied to the objectives and topics that were part of my course. So I developed my own homegrown quantitative skills survey with just 10 questions because I wanted to, I don't want to burden them with a bajillion surveys and questions. So I just said, all right, here's 10 questions. You need to complete this. You're not graded on this, but you need to take this survey before and after the course. There are only 10 multiple choice questions, and they cover most of the big ideas like, do you understand what a p-value is? Can you interpret a Markov model diagram? These are some of the things that we cover in the class. And basically, it showed some modest but substantial gains, which I guess makes sense because they were part of what my course was. But then what I wanted to do is I wanted to see, was there a relationship? So this is what you see here on the x-axis is the change in their score. So the score was just how many questions they got right out of 10. So you can see, so the mean is between 1 and 2. So they on average, they gained 1 to 2 questions on my homegrown skills survey. And then on the y-axis is their final grade, like final score when you combine all these, complete or incomplete and the final project and all these things together. And what you see is there's no relationship, which is frustrating, but I think kind of real when you try to measure a lot of learning. It's hard to do quantitatively. And so I tried to discretize it and say, all right, was there a gain or not, right? So basically, was there a positive score, like number of questions the answer? Was it greater than before or less than before? And this is the final score. And once again, if you do just a t-test or something, it's still not significant. so there's not, okay, so there's not much of a relationship between the grade that they get from the course and the learning gain from this 10-question survey, which is a little frustrating, but that's so I haven't been able to connect those yet. So what do I think? In the end, clearly that student satisfaction seems to have improved in the course after basically. Right, I made as the cool folks say, pointless grading. There's no points. There's no timed exams. The idea is, again, that here are the skills. We will help you learn them, and you can revise your work to learn things better and then fix things, and you can get a good score. But it is a bit tricky to do this, to implement this, both in terms of sometimes students get frustrated with this binary grading, as you might imagine. They're not very, they can get frustrated when you're like, there's only one mistake, but I got a 0, which means incomplete. Like, well, you need to fix that one mistake, right? So my explanation to them is, when you're submitting a paper, it can't be like 80% complete or 90% complete. Oftentimes you really just have to complete everything you need to a reasonable quality, and that's what we expect from them. Anyway, yeah. So in terms of online learning, asynchronous resources worked better for them. And so I don't have the kind of comparison that folks at UCLA did in terms of seeing whether this kind of like contextualized quantitative course works better than the standard like math department quantitative learning. I can't offer that data, unfortunately, because I don't have a comparable group of students. And I'm working with my colleagues, so I would like to get more longitudinal data in terms of what happens to these students as they go in the biology curriculum further down the line, although it's hard to know, there is not a group A and group B to compare against. So that's the one thing that I can't offer. I would love to do a similar comparison to folks at UCLA. But at least, at least based on the independent assessment tools that I showed you, it doesn't look like the learning suffered. I think it seems to be consistent with that conclusion. So that's what I think. And then finally, I want to thank, of course, all of my TAs. So the TAs that I work with are fantastic. They're students who have taken the intro course and then taken my upper level mathematical methods for biosequence. So they have a lot of experience, and I know them, and they know me well. And so they are they are essential for success. And so the team at UCLA, I've been in touch with them for a while. I visited them a few years back. So Alan, Garfinkel, Blair, Vankerberg, they're really motivated and perhaps visionary folks. And so I learned from them. And my colleagues at BSCD at Chicago, so they're folks who are also implementing quantitative, they're kind of infusing quantitative skills into biology courses, Elizabeth Kovar and Ismail Haddadi in other courses, so we collaborate together with them. And I also want to leave you with some links. So I have my textbook that everybody's welcome to check out. It's online, called Quantifying Life, Biosquare assessment. And so another thing that I mentioned is this idea of grading to a certain standard as opposed to taking off points. So something called specifications grading. There's a book that me and my colleagues had sort of read through and thought about by Linda Nilsson et al. And then the course also that they use, the textbook they use at UCLA called Modeling Life by Garfinkel et al. Is here. So if anybody, I don't know if these slides are going to be shared, but all these links are there for folks. And I also want to thank all of you for coming and listening. And I'm very happy to talk about these things more. Thank you.